Seat 4C. Window shade half down. A man in a wrinkled button-down, sleeves pushed to the elbow, nursing a ginger ale he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. Nobody looked at him twice. That was the point. Somewhere over eastern Nebraska, cruising at 31,000 feet, a maintenance fault 3 years in the making finally caught up with Flight 1182. A worn solenoid behind the cockpit door frame. The kind that fails quietly, without warning lights, without a single line in the maintenance log, gave out with a soft click nobody heard over the engine drone. The reinforced door that was supposed to be the last line of defense between 141 passengers and the flight deck was now, for all practical purposes, unlocked. Nathan Reed didn't know that yet. He was 3 rows back, appearing to sleep, eyes closed, breathing slow, and even a habit from another life. One where sleep came in stolen 15-minute increments, and you learned to fake it convincingly in front of people you didn't trust. He learned a lot of things in that life. Most of them were about to matter very much in the next 4 minutes. One more thing before we dive in. Drop your comment, hit that subscribe button, and give this a like if you're the type who reads the room before anyone else does. Trust me, you're going to want to see how this one ends. 20 minutes earlier, boarding had gone the way it always did. Kevin Doyle, gray suit, gold watch, first in line despite flying coach, had shouldered past Nathan at the jet bridge without so much as an apology. "Move it," he'd muttered, loud enough to be heard, quiet enough to seem accidental. Nathan had simply stepped aside and let him pass. That was the other skill nobody clocked. Absorbing friction without generating any of his own. It was practically invisible until you needed it not to be. Grace Turner, senior flight attendant, 17 years in the air, had clocked something different about him. Not his face, his hands. Steady in a way most nervous flyers' hands weren't, and most confident flyers' hands were, either. Just still, like they were waiting. She'd offered him the ginger ale without being asked twice. "Anything else I can get you?" she'd said. "I'm good," Nathan told her. "Thanks." He wasn't lying exactly. He didn't need anything. He was doing what he always did on a job. Watching exits, watching hands, watching the 2 seconds before something happened, because there was always a 2-second window, and almost nobody ever used it. Up front, behind a door that was no longer actually locked, First Officer Andrew Carter shifted in his seat, rubbed at a tightness building low in his chest, and told himself it was nothing. He was wrong. And in 90 seconds, so was everyone else on that airplane who thought this flight was routine. Nathan kept a canvas backpack under the seat in front of him, worn soft at the corners, zipper pull replaced twice. Inside, wrapped in a faded t-shirt, was a leather wallet he hadn't opened since boarding. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what was in it. A badge. A photo ID that didn't say Federal Air Marshal Service in big letters. Nothing on this flight ever announced itself. A small folded card with emergency protocols printed in typeface, so small most people wouldn't bother reading it even if they found it. He'd flown 211 of these routes in 6 years. Most of them ended exactly like they were supposed to, with nobody, not even the crew, ever finding out he'd been there at all. Doyle had settled into 4A, 1 seat over, and was already on his second complaint to Grace about the seatback screen not working. "Do you people even check this stuff before takeoff?" he said, not quite looking at her. Nathan watched him say it. Filed it away. Not because it mattered. Men like Doyle were background noise, the kind of turbulence you flew through without adjusting course. But because noticing things, all the time was the job. It didn't turn off just because the seatbelt sign did. At 31,000 feet, the cabin lights dimmed for the in-flight movie. Grace made her way down the aisle with a beverage cart, humming faintly under her breath. Behind the cockpit door, First Officer Carter's left arm had gone numb to the elbow, and he hadn't told Captain Bishop yet, because he still thought it would pass. Captain Frank Bishop felt it before he understood it. A slight give in cabin pressure differential, a sound behind him that wasn't supposed to exist. He turned in his seat just as the cockpit door swung open on its own, unlatched, swaying gently with the cabin's motion like it had never been locked at all. "Andrew," he started, and then he saw his first officer's face. Gray, sheen with sweat. Carter's right hand had slid off the yoke entirely, and his left was pressed flat against his chest. "Andrew." Andrew, talk to me. Carter didn't answer. His eyes were open, but they weren't tracking. Bishop keyed the intercom with one hand, throwing the aircraft into a hand-flown stability check with the other, years of training taking over even as his pulse spiked. 3 rows back, a passenger near the galley saw the swinging door and the slumped shape in the right seat and did the one thing airline safety briefings spend an entire sentence begging people not to do. He stood up and ran toward it. It was Kevin Doyle. Sir, I have first aid training. Let me through. Grace's voice, sharp and controlled, cut through the cabin noise, but Doyle wasn't listening anymore. He was already past her, one hand out, reaching for the open doorway, for the controls, for anything that looked like it needed a hero. Nathan was out of his seat before Grace finished her sentence. He crossed 3 rows in under 2 seconds, which should have been impossible in a narrow economy aisle full of startled passengers, and somehow wasn't. Doyle got one hand on the doorframe before Nathan's grip closed around his wrist. Not hard, not violent, just absolute, the kind of hold that made resistance feel pointless before the body even finished registering happened. Doyle spun, off balance, more startled than hurt. Get off me, what the hell? Sir, you need to sit down. Nathan's voice was quiet, almost bored, the kind of calm that didn't match the situation at all, and that mismatch was exactly what made Grace go still, watching him instead of Doyle. That man is having a heart attack up there, and nobody's doing anything. Someone is. Nathan guided him backward, firm and unhurried, into the nearest open seat, and it wasn't until Doyle was down and Grace had a hand braced on his shoulder that Nathan let go and turned toward the open cockpit door without being asked. Grace hadn't seen anyone move like that in 17 years of flying. Not once. Who are you? She said, quiet, almost to herself. Nathan didn't answer right away. He was already reaching into his jacket, past the wrinkled button-down, towards something small and flat sewn into the inner lining that Grace hadn't noticed until exactly this second, and wouldn't fully understand for another 30. What Grace was about to see was a wallet Nathan had carried through 11 countries and never once had to produce mid-flight. He flipped it open with a motion so practiced it barely registered as movement. Badge, credentials, a federal seal that made her breath catch. Federal Air Marshal, he said, low enough that only she and the 2 nearest rows could hear. I need this aisle clear, and I need your jump seat radio in about 45 seconds. Grace's mouth opened. Nothing came out first. 17 years, 200 flights, and she had never once had this conversation at cruising altitude. You were sitting in Force C, she said, because it was the only thing that came out, and it sounded absurd even as she said it. That's usually the idea. Nathan was already moving past her, into the cockpit, where Captain Bishop was fighting to keep the aircraft level with one hand while trying to check his first officer's pulse with the other. Who authorized you back? Bishop started, twisting in his seat, and stopped cold when he saw the badge in Nathan's hand. Federal Air Marshal Reed. Your first officer needs immediate medical attention, and I need to know if this door failure was mechanical or something else. Nathan's eyes were already scanning the panel, the door mechanism, Carter's slumped posture, cataloging all of it in the same 2 seconds most people would have spent still processing what they were looking at. Bishop didn't argue. Something in Nathan's voice made arguing feel like the wrong move entirely. Mechanical, Bishop said, hands steady on the yoke despite everything. Door's been sticking for weeks. Maintenance signed off on it Tuesday. Copy that. Nathan crouched beside Carter, 2 fingers at his neck, feeling for a pulse that was there but wrong. Thready, irregular, the kind of rhythm that didn't wait around for anyone's convenience. Carter, Andrew, can you hear me? A faint groan. Not nothing. Not enough, either. Behind him, Grace had already pulled the AED from its wall mount without being told, because some instincts didn't need a badge to activate. About a doctor 3 rows back, she said. Should I? Get her up here. Now. Nathan didn't look up. And get me the flight deck door secured manually. There's an override pin behind the panel. I need it locked before anyone else decides to play hero. Grace hesitated only half a second to how he knew that detail. The override pin wasn't something passengers were supposed to know existed before she moved. Bishop glanced sideways at Nathan, sweat beading at his temple, hands never leaving the controls. "You always fly like this? Sitting 3 rows back, nobody knowing?" "That's the job," Nathan said quietly, already reaching for the pin himself since Grace hadn't returned yet. "Nobody's supposed to know until it matters." Behind them, at 31,000 feet, Doyle sat frozen in his seat, staring at the open cockpit door like he was seeing an entirely different airplane than the one he'd boarded 25 minutes ago. Dr. Michelle Foster arrived breathless, medical bag half open before she reached the cockpit threshold. Nathan gave her the space without being asked, stepping back just far enough to keep working the door mechanism while she took over Carter's care. "Chest pain, numbness left arm, pulse is thready and irregular," Nathan said flat and clinical, the report of a man who'd given 100 of these before. "Onset roughly 6 minutes ago, based on when he stopped responding to radio calls." Foster's eyes flicked up at him, surprised at the precision. "You a medic?" "Something like that." He didn't elaborate. There wasn't time, and some answers weren't his to give at 31,000 feet, with 141 people wondering what was happening past a door that shouldn't have opened at all. The override pin clicked into place under his hands, a small, unremarkable sound that meant the flight deck was finally secure, mechanically at least. Bishop exhaled for what felt like the first time in 5 minutes. "Divert," Nathan said, already reading the nearest airport options off the NAV display over Bishop's shoulder. "Omaha's 12 minutes out, and they've got a cath lab." "That's not your call," Bishop said, but he was already reaching for the radio. "No," Nathan agreed. "It's yours. I'm just telling you what I'd want to hear if I were flying this plane." Bishop kept talking to approach control. Behind him, Foster worked over Carter with quiet urgency, and nobody in that cockpit was thinking about who Nathan Reed had been 20 minutes ago, sipping a ginger ale he never touched. Back in the cabin, word moved the way it always did on an airplane, quietly then all at once. A businessman 2 rows up leaned toward his seatmate. "Did you see that guy? The one in the plaid shirt? He had a badge. Federal something," someone whispered back. "He just walked into the cockpit like he owned it." Grace made her way down the aisle, calm, steady, doing the thing flight attendants did best, making chaos look like procedure. But even she kept glancing back toward the open door, replaying the 2 seconds it had taken Nathan Reed to cross 3 rows and stop a 200-pound stranger without raising his voice once. Doyle hadn't moved from his seat. He was staring at his own hands like he didn't recognize them, the adrenaline drain leaving him hollow and quiet in a way that didn't suit him at all. "You could have gotten yourself killed," Grace said to him, not unkindly, pausing beside his row. "I was trying to help," Doyle muttered. "I know." She almost smiled. "Next time, let the guy in coach with the badge handle it." In the cockpit, Bishop's voice crackled through approach frequency, requesting priority handling into Epley, declaring a medical emergency, his tone tight but controlled. Nathan stood just behind him, one hand braced on the seat back, eyes on the altimeter, on Carter's chest rising and falling under Foster's hands, on the door mechanism he'd just secured with a pin most passengers would never know existed. Somewhere in the avionics bay, a maintenance log entry from 3 weeks ago sat waiting to be found. The first thread in a story nobody on this flight knew was still unfinished. "Copy, Flight 1182. You're cleared for priority approach. Runway 14. Emergency vehicles standing by." The controller's voice was clipped, professional, the kind of calm that only comes from doing this exact job for 20 years. Bishop read back the clearance, hand sure on the controls despite the sweat soaking through his shirt. Beside him, Nathan watched the altitude tape unwind. 31,000, 28, 24. Each 1,000 feet a small negotiation between speed and time neither of them could afford to lose. "ETA?" Nathan asked. 9 minutes. Bishop didn't look over. "You always this calm during an emergency landing, Marshal?" "Only the ones I'm not flying," Nathan said, and something in his voice made Bishop almost laugh despite everything. Behind them, Foster's voice carried a new edge. "Pulse is getting weaker. I need that AED ready the second we're on the ground." Grace appeared in the doorway, breathless. Paramedics are being staged at the gate. Ground crews clearing a fast lane off the jet bridge. Nathan nodded once, already thinking 2 steps ahead. Not just the landing, but the exit, the crowd control, the 140 passengers who were going to walk off this plane with a story they'd tell for the rest of their lives. And the one detail in the maintenance log he still needed to trace once they were on the ground. Because a door didn't just fail on its own, not usually. And Nathan Reed had learned a long time ago never to trust the word usually. 9 minutes. He'd worked with less. 8 minutes out, and the cabin had gone strangely quiet. Not the panicked kind of quiet, but something closer to reverence. 141 people watching an open cockpit door and the shape of a man in a wrinkled button-down moving between the flight deck and the aisle like he'd done this 100 times before. Because he had. Ladies and gentlemen, Grace's voice came over the PA, steady despite everything. We are beginning our descent into Omaha's Eppley Airfield for a precautionary landing. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. She didn't mention the heart attack. She didn't mention the badge. Some things the passengers would piece together on their own, and some things simply weren't hers to say yet. In the cockpit, Foster kept 2 fingers pressed to Carter's wrist, counting under her breath, her face carefully neutral in the way doctors trained themselves to be even when the numbers worried them. He's stabilizing. Barely. Barely's enough, Nathan said. For now. Bishop guided the aircraft through 18,000 feet, the horizon tilting gently as Omaha's skyline came into view through scattered cloud, farmland spreading gold and green below in long, familiar rows. Nathan glanced at it for half a second. Something about the pattern of it, the ordinary quiet of it, tugged at a memory he didn't have time to follow. Marshall, Bishop's voice pulled him back. When we're down, Doyle, the passenger who ran the aisle, he's going to have questions. So is everyone else. Nathan looked back through the open door at the cabin full of faces already turned to watch him. Let them ask, he said quietly. I'm used to it not matching what I say back. 7 minutes out, and the maintenance question was still gnawing at the edge of Nathan's focus, the way an unlatched detail always did until it either resolved itself or bit someone. Bishop, he said, who signed off on the door mechanism Tuesday? I'd have to check the log. Why? Because doors like that don't fail during smooth cruise unless something was already wrong with them, and signed off isn't the same as fixed. Nathan's eyes stayed on the panel, on the small manual pin holding a multi-million-dollar aircraft's last line of defense in place through sheer improvisation. I want that logbook pulled the second we're on the ground, before anyone touches this airplane again. Bishop didn't ask how a passenger, even a badged one, knew to ask that question with such certainty. There wasn't time, and something about the way Nathan said it made arguing feel beside the point. Behind them, Foster's voice carried a fresh note of urgency. He's going into VTACH. I need to shock him the second we're stationary. Tell the paramedics to meet us at the door, not the gate. Copy. Bishop keyed the radio again, voice tightening. Approach, Flight 1182. Medical emergency worsening. Request immediate ground medical at aircraft door, not terminal. Copy that. 1182. EMS staging at the runway. Nathan crouched beside Carter one more time, checking his pulse against his own watch, silent and precise, while below them Omaha's runway lights blinked into focus through the haze, steady, patient, waiting for an airplane that was carrying far more than anyone on it had realized 25 minutes ago. 6 minutes out, and Doyle finally found the nerve to speak again, leaning toward Grace as she passed his row, doing a final cabin check. Is he really a federal marshal? His voice had lost all its earlier edge. The guy in 4C. Looks that way, Grace said. He was sitting right there. The whole flight. I complained to you about the seatback screen in front of him. You did. Grace almost smiled despite the tension still coiled tight in her shoulders. I wouldn't worry about it. I don't think he cares much about seatback screens. Doyle sank back into his seat, quiet, turning the last 25 minutes over in his mind. The man who hadn't reacted to being shoved at the jet bridge, who'd stopped him cold with one hand without so much as raising his voice, who was now standing in an open cockpit doorway, coordinating a diversion like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. 3 rows up, an older man in a Nebraska Cornhuskers cap turned to his wife. You know, he said quietly, reminds me of my brother. Air Force, 22 years. Never talked about what he actually did over there. Just quiet the whole time. Until he wasn't. His wife glanced toward the cockpit door. You think that's what this is? Some kind of military thing before the martial thing. No idea, the man said. But I'd bet good money on it. None of them were wrong. None of them would find out how right they were for another 20 minutes. 5 minutes out, and Nathan allowed himself 30 seconds of stillness. Not rest. Exactly. Just the practice kind of calm he'd learned to manufacture on demand. A skill that had nothing to do with the badge in his jacket, and everything to do with 6 deployments most people in his life would never hear about. He looked at Carter's face, gray but breathing, chest rising and shallow, stubborn rhythm under Foster's hands. He looked at Bishop's white-knuckled grip on the controls, steady despite the fear clearly running underneath it. He looked briefly at the cabin behind him, 141 strangers who'd boarded this flight thinking about connecting gates and in-flight movies, now watching a man they dismissed as a tourist in Seat 4C hold their entire emergency together with 2 words and a steady hand. He thought, not for the first time, that this was the part of the job nobody prepared you for. Not the running, not the restraining holds, not even the split-second calculus of threat versus panic versus procedure. It was this, the quiet after. The part where you realized how much had been riding on you noticing, 2 seconds before anyone else, that something in the cabin had gone wrong. For minutes, Bishop said. Nathan nodded, straightened, and reached for the radio himself. Voice level, unhurried, betraying nothing of the 6 deployments or the 211 flights or the reason his hands never shook when everyone else's did. Approach. This is Air Marshal Reed. Confirming EMS positioning and requesting law enforcement hold all passengers at the gate for statements. Nobody talks to press until we've secured the aircraft. Copy. Marshal Reed. EMS and PD are staged and standing by. Bishop glanced sideways, something shifting in his expression. Not quite surprise anymore, more like recalibration. The look of a man realizing the ground beneath the situation was steadier than he'd assumed. You've done this before. Once or twice, Nathan said. It wasn't once or twice. It was 11 times across 6 years, 11 flights where something had gone wrong at altitude and nobody on board had known there was a trained response sitting 3 rows back in coach, wearing whatever made him forgettable that day. 11 times he'd gone home afterward and told no one, because the job only worked if the next flight, and the one after that, never knew to expect him either. 3 minutes out now, Omaha's runway growing solid and real through the windscreen. Ground crews visible as small clustered shapes near the threshold, ambulance lights strobing red and white even in daylight. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. Grace's voice came over the PA, steadier now, carrying the practice calm of someone who'd found her footing again. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and tray tables are stowed. Nathan moved back to his position near the cockpit doorway, close enough to assist, out of the way of Foster's hands working over Carter's chest. He caught Doyle's eye through the open door. The man from Fort, still pale, still turning the last half hour over in his mind. Doyle didn't say anything. He just gave a small, uncertain nod. Nathan nodded back and thought, not unkindly, that some lessons only landed once the ground did too. 2 minutes out. The runway filled the windscreen now, long and gray and lined with flashing lights, and Bishop's hands moved across the controls with the tight precision of a man running entirely on training because adrenaline alone couldn't be trusted anymore. Gear down, he called, more to himself than to Nathan. Confirmed, Nathan said anyway, watching the indicator lights shift green because backup mattered even when, especially when, the person doing the flying already knew what they were doing. Foster's voice cut through, sharper now. He's crashing. I need him on the ground in the next 90 seconds, or we're doing CPR in the aisle. 90 seconds, Bishop repeated, jaw tight, and pushed the nose down half a degree more than procedure technically allowed, trading comfort for speed in a calculation nobody in the cabin would ever know he'd made. Nathan crouched beside Foster and Carter one last time before touchdown, bracing a hand against the bulkhead. Talk to me. Pulse is barely there. If we lose it on landing, you won't. Nathan sat flat, certain, the way he said everything that mattered. You've kept him this far. 90 more seconds. Foster didn't answer. She didn't have the breath to spare on anything but counting. The runway rushed up gray and fast beneath them, ground crews and ambulances resolving from small shapes into a chaos of motion and light. And somewhere behind Nathan, 141 passengers held a single collective breath as the wheels of Flight 1182 dropped the last 100 feet toward Omaha, Nebraska, and whatever was waiting for all of them on the other side of it. The wheels hit with a jolt that rattled through the whole airframe. Hard, but controlled, exactly the kind of landing you make when smooth is a luxury you can't afford. Reverse thrust roared. Bishop held the center line like it owed him money, and the aircraft screamed down the runway at a deceleration rate that pinned everyone back in their seats. "We're down," Bishop said, voice cracking with something between relief and disbelief. "We're down. Get them ready." Nathan was already moving. Foster had the AD pads in place before the plane had fully stopped rolling, and the instant the aircraft lurched to a halt near the pre-positioned ambulance, ground crew swarmed the forward door with a speed that only came from a dispatch call marked critical. "Clear," Foster called, and the machine delivered its shock, and for one long, terrible second, nothing in that cockpit moved at all. Then Carter's chest hitched. A ragged breath. His eyes fluttered, unfocused, but open. "Pulses back," Foster said, exhaling like she'd been holding it the whole descent. "Weak, but there." Paramedics poured through the forward door seconds later, taking over with practiced efficiency, and Nathan finally stepped back, out of the way, letting the machinery of emergency response do what it did best. He looked down at his own hands. Steady. They always were in the moment. It was afterward, alone, that they sometimes weren't, but nobody on this flight would ever know that part of him either. Behind him, the cabin erupted into the low murmur of 141 people simultaneously exhaling 6 minutes of held tension. Somewhere near the back, someone started clapping. It spread forward, row by row, uncertain at first and then not. Nathan didn't turn around for it. He was watching the paramedics load Carter onto a gurney, watching Bishop follow 2 steps behind with his hand braced against the fuselage like his legs weren't entirely trustworthy yet, watching Foster wipe her palms on her slacks with the particular exhaustion of someone who'd just spent 9 minutes keeping a stranger alive through sheer will. Grace appeared at his shoulder. "You should sit down. You've been standing since." "I'm Phoenix." "You're not, actually. You're just good at looking like it." She said it without judgment, more observation than accusation, and something about the accuracy of it made Nathan almost smile. "Occupational hazard," he said. Outside, airport police had formed a loose perimeter around the aircraft, and a supervisor in a reflective vest was already climbing the jet bridge, stairs 2 at a time, radio crackling at his hip. Doyle stood near his seat, still not moving, watching Nathan with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the last 20 minutes from irritation to something closer to shame. "Marshal Reed," Grace said quietly. "For what it's worth, I've flown 17 years. I've never seen anyone do what you just did." Nathan looked at the open cockpit door, at the small manual pin still holding it steady, and said nothing at all. The police supervisor, a broad-shouldered man named Jason Hoffman with an Omaha PD badge and a voice built for crowd control, stepped aboard and found Nathan waiting for him near row 4, credentials already out. "Marshal Reed," Hoffman said, glancing at the badge, then at Nathan's face like he was cross-referencing it against something. "Dispatch flagged your ID the second Bishop called it in. Command's already pulled your file." "Copy," Nathan said. "I need that maintenance log secured before anyone touches this aircraft." The cockpit door failure wasn't random. Hoffman's eyebrows lifted slightly. "You think it was tampered with?" "I think signed off Tuesday and failed today at cruise altitude don't add up, and I don't like things that don't add up at 31,000 feet. Nathan's voice stayed level, but something underneath it had sharpened. "I want FBI Aviation liaison notified, and I want that logbook in an evidence bag within the hour." "You got it." Hoffman keyed his radio, relaying the request, then paused, studying Nathan a beat longer than procedure required. "You were Army before this, weren't you?" "I can always tell." Nathan didn't answer right away. "Air Force," he said finally, quiet enough that only Hoffman caught it. Pararescue. A long time ago. Hoffman's expression shifted, some internal calculation clicking into place. That explains a few things. Behind them, Grace had gone very still, close enough to have heard every word, filing away a detail Nathan hadn't meant to give anyone at all. Pararescue. The word moved through the small cluster of people who'd overheard it. Grace, Hoffman, a paramedic lingering near the door. The way certain words did, quietly reshaping everything that happened in the last 30 minutes into something with a longer history behind it. Doyle, still hovering near his seat, caught the tail end of it and frowned, something tugging at his memory. "Wait," he said, half to himself. "Pararescue. That's the ones who go get down pilots. Behind enemy lines. That's classified mission history I'm not going to discuss on a runway in Omaha," Nathan said, not unkindly, cutting the thread before it could unspool any further. "I appreciate the interest. I really do. But right now I've got a maintenance log to secure and a first officer in an ambulance." Doyle nodded quickly, something in his posture softening from shame into a kind of quiet, embarrassed respect. "Right. Sorry. Earlier when I tried to run up there, you didn't even look angry. You just stopped me. Like it was nothing." "It wasn't nothing," Nathan said. "It just wasn't the first time." He turned back toward Hoffman before Doyle could ask what that meant, already thinking 2 steps ahead again, toward Carter's chances at the hospital, toward the logbook that might explain a door failure that shouldn't have happened, toward the 11 other flights nobody would ever ask him about, because the job only worked when it stayed invisible. Behind him, unnoticed, Grace had already pulled out her phone, not to call anyone, just to write down a name she suspected she'd be looking up the second she got home. 2 hours later, the terminal at Epley had mostly cleared of the chaos. Passengers rebooked on a later connections, statements taken by airport police, the aircraft itself now cordoned off on a remote stand, while an FAA inspector and an FBI aviation liaison pored over a maintenance logbook that had, as Nathan suspected, more questions in it than answers. The Tuesday sign-off, it turned out, had been a rushed inspection during a tight turnaround, a solenoid flagged as monitor instead of replace, a judgment call that had seemed reasonable at a gate in Denver and catastrophic at 31,000 feet over Nebraska. Not sabotage. Worse, in its way, the ordinary kind of failure that came from nobody having quite enough time. Nathan gave his statement twice, once to airport police and once to the FBI liaison, flat and precise. The way he gave every statement, stripped of anything that wasn't directly relevant to the incident timeline. He didn't mention pararescue again. He didn't need to. Hoffman had already made the calls that mattered, and word had a way of traveling through people who understood what certain silences meant. Captain Bishop found him near the gate area afterward, off duty now, still in uniform but with his tie loosened, his hands finally steady. "Carter's stable," Bishop said. "Cardiologist says another 10 minutes, and it would have been a different conversation." "Good," Nathan said, and meant it entirely. "You saved my first officer's life today, Marshal, and probably my career, if I'm honest. I don't know how to." "You don't have to," Nathan said. "You flew the plane. I just made a few phone calls sound urgent." Bishop laughed, short and genuine. The first real laugh Nathan had heard from him since the door had swung open. "Is that what we're calling it?" "That's what I'm calling it in my report," Nathan said, and something in his tone made it clear that was as close to a joke as he was likely to offer. Grace approached from the gate desk, having finally traded her flight uniform blazer for a cardigan. Off the clock, but not quite able to leave yet. She held out a coffee, black, no sugar, the way she'd noticed him not asking for anything the entire flight. "Figured you might actually want this now," she said, "since you never touched the ginger ale." Nathan took it, something almost like a smile crossing his face. "Observant. Occupational hazard," she said, echoing his own words back at him, and this time he did smile, briefly, before it faded back into the careful neutrality he wore like a second uniform. "For what it's worth," Grace added quieter now, "I looked you up while we were waiting on the tarmac." Nathan didn't ask what she'd found. There wasn't much to find by design, a name, a service record with more redactions and details, a handful of commendations listed without explanation. "You won't find the parts that matter," he said simply. "I figured." She studied him a moment longer. "Doesn't change what I saw today, though." Across the gate area, Doyle stood near the rebooking counter, watching the exchange from a distance, still working up the nerve for something he clearly hadn't finished saying. Doyle crossed the gate area with the stiff, deliberate walk of a man forcing himself through something uncomfortable. He stopped a few feet from Nathan, hands shoved in his pockets, and for a moment just stood there. "I wanted to say I'm sorry," he said finally. "For earlier. Both times. The jet bridge and running up the aisle like an idiot." "You wanted to help," Nathan said. "That's not nothing. I could have made it worse. You knew what you were doing." "I didn't." Doyle exhaled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "My father was Navy. 30 years. I used to think I knew what that kind of calm looked like." He shook his head. "I didn't, not really. Not until today." Nathan didn't offer platitudes. He never did. "Give him a call tonight," he said instead. "Tell him about the flight." Guys like that, they like knowing someone still notices what quiet costs. Doyle blinked, caught off guard by the specificity of it. Like Nathan had reached into something private without meaning to. "Yeah," he said slowly. "Yeah, I will." He extended a hand. Nathan shook it, brief and firm, and Doyle walked away toward the rebooking line without looking back, already reaching for his phone. Bishop watched the exchange with quiet interest. "You do that a lot? Read people like that?" "It's the only part of the job that doesn't stop when the flight lands," Nathan said, and picked his coffee back up. By the time Nathan collected his bag from the gate, the same worn canvas backpack, badge wallet returned to its hidden pocket, coveralls and combat boots left behind in a life he rarely spoke of, the terminal had mostly returned to its ordinary rhythm. Announcements. Rolling suitcases. 130-some strangers scattering toward connections and rental cars and rides home. Most of them already composing the story they'd tell everyone they knew. Hoffman caught him near the exit doors, badge still clipped to his vest. FAA's grounding that solenoid model fleet-wide, pending inspection. "You probably just kept this from happening on some other flight, too." "Wasn't the plan," Nathan said. "But I'll take it." "You need a ride anywhere?" "I've got a connection in 2 hours." "I'll be fine." Nathan slung the backpack over one shoulder, already thinking about the quiet apartment waiting for him at the other end of this trip, the kind of unremarkable life he'd built specifically so days like today stayed rare. Grace found him one last time near security, off-duty, coat over her arm. "You're really just going to disappear into the next flight, aren't you? Like none of this happened." "That's the job," Nathan said. "Nobody's supposed to know until it matters." "It mattered today." "Yeah," he said, and for just a moment, something behind his careful composure loosened. It did. She didn't ask for anything more than that. Some men, she was learning, only gave you exactly what they meant to, and no more. Nathan Reed didn't take the aisle seat on his connecting flight. He took the window, pulled the shade halfway down, and closed his eyes the way he always did. Not quite sleeping, just resting, watching without watching, the way a man does when noticing things never fully turns off, badge or no badge, uniform or none. Nobody on that flight would ever know what he'd done 6 hours earlier over Nebraska. That was the point. That was always the point. Somewhere behind him, Andrew Carter was recovering in a hospital bed in Omaha. Frank Bishop was filing an incident report that would quietly change fleet maintenance procedures nationwide, and Kevin Doyle was on the phone with his father, telling him about a stranger in seat 4C who'd taught him something about quiet he hadn't expected to learn at 30,000 feet. Nathan wouldn't hear about any of that. He rarely did. The job ended the moment the wheels stopped and the next flight began, and somewhere out there, another aircraft was already waiting for a man nobody would notice until the exact second they needed to. If this story hit home, drop a comment telling us what you would have done in Kevin Doyle's seat. Would you have run for the cockpit or trusted the stranger who never touched his ginger ale? Hit that like button and subscribe for more unforgettable military and aviation stories.